Welcome back, weary listener. Tonight on Sleepy History, we journey into the medieval chill. Before we settle in, please let me know in the comments what country you're listening from and what time the long night found you. Let the journey commence. The modern world makes winter manageable, yet even today, it presents its challenges. But imagine life centuries ago, in the Middle Ages, where comfort was a rarity and life was dictated by nature. This was a battle not just with the cold, but with hunger, disease, and unending darkness. We are about to delve into the stark reality of the medieval winter, exploring everything from the damp chill within an aristocrat's stone castle to the shared warmth of a peasant's hut. Prepare yourselves. We are embarking on a journey into history's longest, darkest nights. Establishing the climatic and temporal context. First, we must establish the climatic context. The Middle Ages were not climatically uniform. This vast era spanned a multitude of seasonal experiences. We often generalize, but the reality was complex. The period spanning roughly 950 to 1300 AD is known as the medieval warm period. This era brought relatively milder winters and warmer summers to Northern Europe. This seemingly simple climatic shift was a profound boon for civilization. It improved agricultural yields, allowing the population to grow, and even facilitated the major geopolitical expansion of the Vikings, who found new settlements more viable. This allowed for a certain degree of seasonal predictability that made winter preparations slightly more reliable, yet still demanding. However, this period of mildness was bracketed by extremes. Consider the grim events of the early Middle Ages, specifically the volcanic winter of 536 AD. Ash clouds, likely from massive eruptions, darkened the sky for years. Contemporary accounts speak of a sun that gave off no shadow, crops that failed, and snow that fell even in August. This kind of sudden, profound climatic shock meant that winter became an immediate existential threat, not a predictable annual hardship, but a sudden, terrifying disaster that overwhelmed all preparations. Setting aside these cataclysmic events, the typical medieval winter across Europe was generally long, intensely dark, and persistently damp. It was a season that tested the very fabric of society. Survival depended on four fundamental pillars, prepared meticulously in the fading light of autumn: food, fuel, shelter, and morale. The autumnal rush, pillars of survival. Preparation for winter was a race against time. Once the harvest was complete, the real work began. The grain was stored in granaries, safe from pests and moisture. Vegetables and root crops were placed in simple root cellars or covered pits to prevent freezing. The most critical step was the animal cull, or Martinmas slaughter. During the lean months of winter, there simply wasn't enough preserved hay or fodder to feed all the livestock. Therefore, a significant portion of the pigs, cattle, and sheep had to be slaughtered. This provided a massive but temporary influx of protein. The meat was immediately preserved using the only reliable techniques available: heavy salting, deep smoking, or drying into jerky. Every single part of the animal was used: hides for leather, fat for tallow candles and cooking, bones for tools and broth. Waste was an absolute impossibility. Next came fuel. The relentless consumption of wood for heating, cooking, and light made wood cutting and charcoal production one of the most intense ongoing tasks. Families and communities would stockpile massive amounts of firewood. For the peasant, every log represented life. For the lord, every load ensured his retainers did not freeze at their posts. Finally, there was shelter and clothing. Every crack in the walls of a cottage or a castle had to be sealed. Windows were shuttered tight. People lived in layers of thick, often scratchy wool, supplemented by leather and animal skins. For the aristocracy, the ability to wear furs, marten, fox, or ermine, was a visible sign of wealth and, more importantly, a crucial piece of insulation against the ubiquitous damp chill. The persistent moisture meant that even the thickest wool could feel perpetually clammy. The castle's iron grip, aristocratic winter. We now step inside the castle walls. From the outside, the fortress was a symbol of power and permanence. Inside, it was a magnificent, yet deeply uncomfortable, prison of stone. Stone walls are excellent thermal masses. They hold heat poorly, and once cold, they stay cold. They offered protection from enemies, but relentlessly radiated the cold inward, often making the interior feel little warmer than the courtyard outside. The castle's primary enemy was dampness. As any small pocket of warm air, perhaps from breath or a fleeting fire, rose and hit the icy stone, it would instantly condense. The walls would literally sweat water, creating a perpetual clamminess. This dampness was destructive. It rotted the wooden frames of furniture, caused heavy mildew to form on expensive bedding and clothing, and made the woven tapestries, which hung as primitive insulation, heavy and moldy. The air carried a constant, heavy smell of rot and moisture. Heating was a monumental failure. The Great Hall, the social and ceremonial center, relied on a massive central hearth or fire pit. This fire might consume entire oak trunks in a day, yet the heat immediately rose and was lost to the high ceilings. It created a small pocket of warmth directly around the flames, but the rest of the vast hall remained frigid. Even in the lord's private apartments, there was usually only one fireplace. While it offered better focused heat, it was utterly incapable of warming the room's entirety. People were forced to huddle near the heat source or retreat to their beds. Personal warmth was a desperate act of preservation. Beds were luxurious fortresses. They were often surrounded by thick curtains and canopies to trap body heat. Servants would use heated stones or clay vessels filled with hot water to pre-warm the bedding. People slept in caps and multiple layers of clothing. The castle kitchen was the only consistently warm place, though it was often poorly ventilated and smoky. The winter menu relied on the autumn slaughter. Meats, typically salted pork, beef and venison that had been dried or smoked, formed the core. Fresh food was scarce. Spices, imported at vast expense, were vital. They were a sign of status, but also a practical necessity used to flavor and disguise the slightly spoiled or monotonous taste of preserved food that had been sitting for months. The castle's hidden horrors. Hygiene and death. The greatest discomforts in the castle were hidden from view. Hygiene was universally poor, but the cold made bathing and cleaning a monumental task. The waste system, the latrine chute or garderobe, was a sanitation nightmare. These simple holes in the wall directed human waste outside or into the moat. In freezing temperatures, the waste would often freeze solid before it could fall clear, creating large accumulating piles of frozen sewage. The true horror emerged with the spring thaw, when the piles melted, releasing clouds of noxious odors and creating a vector for dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases that plagued the castle populace. The most heartbreaking truth of the medieval winter was the lethal effect of the cold on the most vulnerable. Childbirth in a stone castle was a perilous event. The cold, damp rooms, combined with the lack of access to clean, warm water and primitive medical knowledge, meant that infant mortality rates soared during the winter months. Newborns, desperately susceptible to hypothermia, struggle to survive their first weeks. It was a somber understanding that the long nights often claim the smallest and weakest lives. The peasant's hearth. Shared warmth and work. Moving down the social ladder, we find a different, yet equally challenging survival story. The typical peasant dwelling was a small, single-room cottage, built of timber framing filled with wattle and daub, woven sticks and mud, and roofed with thatch or turf. These homes were humble but efficient. Their core survival feature was the shared living space with the animals. Livestock, pigs, goats, and a cow, were often kept in a partitioned section of the cottage, or sometimes right in the main room. Their collective body heat, though smelly and unsanitary, provided a vital, consistent, low-level warmth that often made the cottage more tolerable than the castle. Heating was provided by a central, open hearth. There was usually no chimney. The smoke simply rose and filtered out through the thatch. This made the room smoky and dim, but the smoke also acted as a deterrent to insects and helped preserve the wooden structure. Light was minimal, relying on the weak glow of the fire, or precious, expensive tallow candles or rush lights. With the fields frozen or snowbound, farm work ground to a halt. The labor moved indoors, focusing on craftsmanship and maintenance. Men were busy mending tools, repairing harnesses, and carving wood. Women and children were focused on textile production, spinning thread from wool or flax, weaving, knitting, and mending clothes. These tasks provided essential goods and kept hands busy during the long, dark hours. These chores were often communal. Spinning bees were significant social events, particularly for young women. In some cultures, prestige was given to the fastest or most skilled spinner, who earned the right to sit closest to the fire or candle, the most valuable source of light and warmth. These gatherings provided a much-needed outlet for socializing and courtship during the otherwise isolating winter. The peasant diet was simple and monotonous. It consisted primarily of cereal grains, made into bread or thick pottage, a stew or porridge, supplemented by preserved vegetables like cabbage, beans, and the remaining salted pork fat. Every calorie was precious. The fear of starvation was a constant companion. If the previous harvest had been poor, the period from February to April, known as the Hungry Gap, was a time of severe anxiety and potential famine. The winter
When the
social
stored
fabric,
food
faith
ran
and
out
inequality.
before the first spring
Despite the
crops
crushing
could be
hardship,
harvested.
winter provided crucial cultural breaks. The most important was Christmas. This period of the Christian calendar provided a vital distraction and spiritual anchor. It was marked by special masses, communal feasting, often the only time peasants ate meat in abundance, singing and storytelling. It was a powerful, unifying force against the darkness. But winter, more than any other season, exposed the brutal inequalities of the feudal system. The cold was the great revealer of class. While the lord might suffer the dampness of his great hall, he was guaranteed food, clothing, and a warm fire, however inefficient. The peasant was merely guaranteed survival if the harvest was sufficient and his lord was merciful. For the domestic servants and serfs, their comfort was entirely secondary. They endured the deepest cold in drafty servants' quarters or worked in the icy courtyards, their duty being to keep their masters warm by chopping wood and drawing water from frozen wells. A warm, undisturbed night's sleep was, in essence, an aristocratic privilege, the final thaw and legacy. Finally, after months of darkness, the days would lengthen, the ice would crack, and the thaw would begin. This moment was both a physical and spiritual relief. But the thaw brought new dangers. The rush of melting snow could cause flooding, and the ground, sodden from the snow and rain, made travel impossible. The thaw also revealed the winter's toll. The stench from accumulated filth in towns and near castles would become overpowering, signaling the start of the season for major epidemics. It was a time to count the losses, those claimed by the bitter cold, disease, or the hungry gap, and prepare the fields again, often using the manure accumulated over the winter months. Life was cyclical, and the spring meant a return to labor, but also a return to hope. The medieval winter was a relentless test of human ingenuity and spiritual resilience. It was a challenge that forced people to be creative, thrifty, and above all, deeply reliant on their community and their faith. Whether within the cold embrace of a stone castle or the smoky warmth shared with their animals, the people of the Middle Ages faced a seasonal battle that makes our modern struggles seem trivial. Every single person who survived the dark, damp, and hungry months of winter was a true victor
America's
in the
different
most
faces of
fundamental
winter.
war.
The
Our
war
narrative
for life
now shifts
itself.
across the Atlantic, away from Europe to the American continents, where unique civilizations thrived during the same historical period, 500 to 1500 AD, without European contact. Here the concept of winter varied drastically, yet still presented a vital struggle for survival. In the northern regions of the continent, corresponding to modern-day Canada and the northern US, winters were often as fierce as, or even more brutal and prolonged than, those in Europe. However, the preparation methods of the indigenous tribes were fundamentally different. Instead of stone buildings, northern tribes often constructed semi-subterranean pit houses during the cold months. These shelters utilized the Earth's natural insulation to maintain a more stable interior temperature and offered superior protection against blizzards. Heating came from central hearths, with smoke vented through small, carefully managed holes. Their survival strategy revolved around hunting and fishing. The crucial autumn hunt, which stalked large game like bison, transitioned into a winter of reliance on cured meats, jerky, and smoked fish. The deep winter became a time for indoor community activities, rituals, storytelling, and the meticulous repair of tools and equipment. Moving south to Mesoamerica, the realms of the Maya and Aztecs, in the tropical coasts of Brazil, the European idea of winter, featuring snow and frost, vanished entirely. Here the central struggle was not against cold, but against the extremes of the annual rain cycle. In Brazil, before the arrival of the Portuguese, thousands of indigenous tribes, mostly nomadic or semi-nomadic, lived along the rivers and coastlines, subsisting on hunting and fishing. For them, winter was defined by either the peak of the rainy season, bringing floods and disease, or the most intense dry season, forcing changes in hunting routes. Their survival hinged on a harmonious, migratory lifestyle tailored to these specific climatic shifts, not on stockpiling wood against a relentless freeze. Meanwhile, in the high Andes Mountains, the territory of the Inca and their predecessors, fierce cold, ice, and snow were a reality. These mountain civilizations perfected cold-weather architecture with stone structures, utilized thick llama and alpaca wool clothing, and developed superior storage techniques for cold-resistant crops like potatoes and quinoa. The indispensable role of animals in winter survival beyond being a source of meat preserved through the Martinmas slaughter, animals were utterly central to medieval winter life. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, livestock offered vital, continuous warmth. Cattle, pigs, and goats were often housed in a partitioned area or even the same room as the family. The combined body heat of these animals helped to keep the small, poorly insulated cottage from freezing, transforming the dwelling into a miniature, albeit smelly and unhygienic, ecosystem of survival. The animal's presence made the difference between enduring the winter and perishing from the cold. Furthermore, animals provided essential daily sustenance even when the snows were deep. Milk, though production dropped significantly, eggs, and the manure used as fertilizer or sometimes even fuel. For the aristocracy, horses and hunting dogs required immense care. Their stables had to be maintained, and their food, often precious grain, had to be strictly rationed, a task performed by servants who themselves often slept in freezing conditions to ensure the Lord's prized possessions survived the long, dark nights. The survival of the human population was fundamentally intertwined with the survival of their herd. Conclusion: a global resilience. The medieval winter was a relentless test of human ingenuity and spiritual resilience, regardless of the continent. Whether it was the freezing damp of a European castle, the subterranean warmth of a North American pit house, or the rainy season struggle of a Brazilian tribe, the cold, or the climatic shift, served as the ultimate master of destiny. It was a challenge that forced people to be creative, thrifty, and above all, deeply reliant on their community and their faith. Every single person who survived the dark, damp, and hungry months of winter was a true victor in the most fundamental war, the war for life itself.